Hi, how you doing? The video I released fairly recently looking at Jack Broughton and his influence on boxing and pugilism seemed to be relatively popular. And a few people have asked for similar videos, so what I thought we'd look at today is a gentleman by the name of Jack Slack. Now, if you're in any way interested in the pugilistic arts, in either a modern or a historical sense, you've probably come across the writer Jack Slack. I'm assuming that you know that he writes under a pseudonym. I don't know the guy. His stuff's very good. I've always enjoyed it and still do. But he's actually taken the name of a famous historical boxer. And it's quite an interesting choice, because to all intents and purposes, Jack Slack had a terrible reputation. He was born in 1721 in a small village just outside Norwich, and from a young age, he was naturally gifted at fighting, and spent a lot of time hanging out in travelling fairs and carnivals, trying his hand at boxing and doing very, very well indeed. When he grew up, he got a job at working as a slaughterman, but carried on fighting, and eventually became the Norfolk champion. And after a little while, he was challenged by the Suffolk champion, and the two of them fought, and Slack emerged the victor, and quite considerably so. It was a very one-sided fight. At which point he was effectively patronised by some of the members of the fancy who'd been there and seen the fight, who took him to London and effectively made him their fighter. And he did pretty well. He was relatively successful, had a fairly brutal and simplistic style, wasn't regarded as being particularly scientific, but he was powerful, and he was strong, and he had what was referred to at the time as great bottom. It's not a word that we use these days in that context, but effectively it's talking about gameness. Fighters were judged on their science and their bottom. He did pretty well. In the early 1750, he was fighting at Broughton's amphitheatre. And this was after the introduction of Broughton's rules. So we'll know at that point that we know exactly what rules he was fighting to. He was fighting a guy called George Taylor, I believe it was, who was the former champion, the champion before Broughton. At this time, Broughton was the reigning champion of all England, but Slack was fighting against Taylor. And during the fight, he took a fairly punishing blow, and he was a little bit stunned, and he fell over. And as he fell, he hit his head. And as he came back up to scratch, Broughton ruled that he'd taken slightly too long, and it was only marginally, and awarded the fight to Taylor. Slack was not impressed at all by this and took this as a huge personal affront, and was very unhappy to have lost the fight, because this was effectively how he made his living, and if he was losing fights that he should be winning, then he wasn't earning any money, but also his patrons, the members of the fancy, the rich members of the gentry who were effectively, if you like, sponsoring him, would be likely to leave him and find someone else. So he was very unhappy, and to all intents and purposes he was not a particularly pleasant man. It's hard to say for certain, because he doesn't have a good reputation, but that mainly comes from what happened next. Later that year, Jack Broughton was at Hounslow Races as a guest of the Duke of Cumberland and the Prince of Wales. And Slack also happened to be there, and he saw Broughton and stormed across to him and basically caused a bit of a fight. He insinuated that Broughton was a cheat and a liar, and that he'd been paid to give the fight to Taylor instead of to Slack. The two of them had a bit of a set to, and Broughton whipped Slack with his riding cane across the legs, at which point Slack picked up a large carving knife from the table and went to get his revenge, but was pulled away by the people that were watching. The two of them pretty much at that point were destined to fight. Broughton had officially retired but was still champion. Nobody else had come along to take the title, but Broughton hadn't fought in quite a long time, and Slack was really at the peak of his ability. But Slack challenged Broughton and Broughton accepted. And everybody at this point assumed that this was pretty much a done deal. Broughton was this fantastic fighter who had up to this point never lost. And that's quite an achievement. He was Figg's pupil, he was the face of boxing, he was the reigning champion, and he'd created a rule set in order to revolutionise boxing. Slack was a man known as the Norfolk Butcher, partly because of his trade, and partly because of his style of fighting. It was brutal, it was unscientific, but it worked. So they set a date for 3 months' time, and the two of them met at Broughton's amphitheatre to fight. The crowds were huge, everybody was charged to get in, and amongst the crowd was the Duke of Cumberland, who was Broughton's specific patron, and also the Prince of Wales was there. You have to understand what a coup that was, because at the time, boxing, pugilism was technically illegal, yet the Prince of Wales was there watching it along with various members of the nobility and the gentry. So the two of them fought, and initially, at least, everybody's predictions seemed to be coming true. Broughton was brilliant. He moved around the ring, he was fast, he was agile, he evaded Slack, he looked at the peak of his science. And after a couple of rounds, he caught Slack with such a hard punch right in the throat that it literally dropped him like a stone, lifeless on the floor. Everybody cheered, and at this point the Prince of Wales offered Broughton, I think it was an extra 1,000 guineas if he won the fight. But because of what had happened before, Slack was not going to give up unless he absolutely had to. He managed to get back to his feet and struggled back up to scratch within the allotted time. Now it has to be said at this point that the fight was kind of stacked against Slack, because the captain of the fight, the referee at this point, was clearly not Broughton, because Broughton was fighting, but that was Broughton's role in fighting at that point. It was none other than George Taylor, who Slack had lost to before, and Taylor was effectively one of Broughton's protégés. They worked together, and Broughton ran the arena and Taylor fought for him. So if this fight was going to go any way, it was going to go Broughton's way. But it didn't. Shortly after the next round started, Slack caught Broughton with a really particularly heavy blow called the chopper. Now, I don't know if you've come across this before, but the chopper is a rolling back fist blow. You'll see some people these days describing the chopper as a hammer fist, and it's absolutely not. It's very clear. Look at Mendoza's treatise, and it describes the chopper using the back of the hand, as does Futrell. These are all contemporaries, people from this era. They describe the chopper as a rolling back fist blow. The back of the hand is used to strike across the bridge of the nose, and that's when it's done perfectly. That's how it works. And that's exactly what Slack did. A number of people say that Slack had a peculiar guard. I've not found any historical reference to that. If you have, please let me know, because I'd love to say. He's thought by several people to have fought in a guard that brings his arm across so that he can throw this chopper out. And either way, he hit Broughton right across the bridge of the nose, across the brow, and it was perfect. It dropped Broughton to the ground. Now Broughton got back up, and he had his 30 seconds to get back up to scratch, but by the time he got back up to scratch, his eyes had started to swell shut. And the next round was an absolute travesty of boxing. Effectively, Broughton could not see his opponent, and Slack continued to hit him. At this point, Broughton could do nothing about it. He was flailing wildly and was floored again. Clearly, his patrons were not happy. The Duke of Cumberland was very unhappy about this. And Broughton was heard to say, I cannot see, just put me on the scratch and I'll win. They did, and he didn't. He couldn't see, he couldn't hit Slack, and Slack could hit him, and very quickly the fight was over. And Broughton had his title taken from him by a man who was already hugely unpopular. Nobody expected Slack to keep this title very long, and nobody particularly liked him, but what this fight had done is it had destroyed Broughton's reputation with the Duke of Cumberland, who effectively turned his back on Broughton from that moment and walked away and became Slack's patron. Which is a bit of a shame. He accused Broughton of throwing the fight, which Broughton was very unhappy about. But anyway, this isn't about Broughton, this is about Slack. Everybody said that Slack was vastly inferior to Broughton, and yet he'd beaten him. But that doesn't really reflect the true story about Jack Slack, because Jack Slack went on to hold the title for 10 years. And unlike Broughton, he didn't retire and keep the title in name only. He continued to defend this title. He fought several times against several people, including Jean Petit, the French champion, who travelled to England to fight against Slack. And Slack hit him so hard that when he stood back up again, not only did this guy give in, he literally turned around and walked out of the ring without saying a word, refused to fight him again. Slack was a great fighter, but everybody hated him. For a number of reasons. Firstly, he was the guy that humiliated the great Broughton, and Broughton was loved by everyone. So people were disposed to dislike Slack. But also, by the standards of the day, Slack was not a pretty man. He was relatively ugly. He'd taken a bit of a beating several times and had a bit of a misshapen face. He was scarred and he was unhappy. He was not liked. He moved away from London very quickly. He didn't like living there. Despite being the champion, despite holding the title, and despite defending it successfully, he was reviled. So he moved to Bristol. And in Bristol, he had a family, and he coached boxing. And later on, in another video, we'll learn a little bit about Slack's grandson, who was also a very famous and successful boxer. 10 years after defeating Broughton in 1760, he lost the title to an absolute unknown by the name of Bill Stevens. And at that point, Slack pretty much vanishes from the record book. Nobody really wanted to be writing about Slack, and at the first opportunity they dropped him. Yet, he was probably one of the greatest boxers out there. His style was not aesthetically pleasing, neither was he. And he had the misfortune to be the man that took Broughton's title, but he was good, he was strong, he was powerful, and he had great bottom. The other thing that Slack did was he established the provinces as a place where serious boxing was taking place. Up to that point, you had to travel to London if you wanted to be taken seriously. But after Slack, that wasn't the case. Bristol became effectively a second centre of pugilism within the UK, and some of the greatest names of boxing came from Bristol. We'll talk more about those in later videos. But that's the basic story of Jack Slack, the Norfolk Butcher. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you've got any questions, please put them in the comments below. If you haven't subscribed, please do click on the subscribe button. I'd really, really appreciate it if you did. I'm desperately hoping to get to 10,000 subscribers quickly because I've got a really cool plan for when I do. Like the video, that's always nice, and please stick something in the comments. If you'd like to support me, please check out my Patreon page. I talk about this a lot, and it is hugely helpful to me. Martial arts is my living. So if I can make a little bit of money from putting these videos out there for everyone to see, then that would be fantastic. You can support me with as little as $1 a month. It's entirely down to you. I'm not going to stop making these videos if you don't, but I'd really like it if you did. Anyway, I'll quit with the adverts and I'll get back to this. Take care.